sort of hard to get every little thing. So these non-native species can have detrimental impacts to our native biota in a few different ways. So the first is competition. If you have something that grows really quickly, that crowds out native species, blocks their light, steals their water and maybe their nutrients or their substrates, pretty soon you're going to have a monoculture of invasive species and you're going to lose a lot of your native diversity. Any of you guys that raised your hands before work on Myconia eradication? This is a big one on Big Island especially. They have a lot of Myconia, which is an invasive plant. It's got these really nice looking trees. I think it's a beautiful plant. Beautiful purple underside and then sort of a green top side. They produce a lot of shade and they can grow really well in wet areas where they reproduce really quickly. So it can be, by the time you actually detect Myconia in gullies or inaccessible areas, it can be really, really hard to eradicate them. They put out a lot of seeds and they'll just take over an area and just have a monoculture of Myconia. A lot of plants sort of similar to this that have similar strategies. Predation is another big one where we've introduced a lot of predators. In our snail talk, we talked about two invasive predators that we introduced on purpose. One was the Jackson's chameleon, and one was a carnivorous snail that's attacking a lot of our native invertebrates, including our native tree snails. The brown tree snake is something that hasn't really gotten here yet, but everybody is really, really scared that it will. This is a big deal on Guam. It's a tree snake, so it lives in trees. It slithers up, and it really does well attacking birds and birds' nests. This was introduced in Guam during the war, so this was unintentionally introduced. And immediately after the introduction, Guam lost pretty much all of its seabirds, most of its native forest birds, most of its native mammals, and most of its native lizards as well. This thing is an omnivore that'll eat anything it can get its hands on. And it can get up into canopies, and its density is so high that it's causing a lot of havoc, crawling into people's like electrical boxes and shorting out and causing brownouts. It gets into sewage drains. It'll crawl up into people's toilets, which is pretty scary. It's nasty. It's nasty, and it's really because of our invasive frog population here with the coqui frogs. That would be just the perfect prey for this brown tree snake. So if it ever did get here, if we did get a pregnant female, you know, it would go crazy in Hawaii. It would have a wonderful time here. It would not be pretty. Yeah.
So you could be in Guam. You could be taking a dunk on a toilet, and that thing will be crawling out of your.
That's what I'm saying. So I'll show you just a little news clip about the tree snake and some of the ways that they're trying to combat this in Guam with limited success.
What do you do with an island full of snakes? Hit them with a bunch of mice. 2,000 to be exact. That's the US government's latest plan to rid Guam of its brown snake infestation problem. The rodents were airdropped, parachutes and all, into the country Sunday. Their job? Get eaten by the snakes. See, the mice were already dead and were filled with poisonous painkillers deadly to snakes.
It basically goes after everything it can acquire here. We thought it would be limited at first. Okay, if it wipes out the birds, populations will decline. Wasn't the case. It just switched what it was feeding on.
The snakes have also caused millions of dollars of damage to power lines. They cause the power failures after they slither inside electrical boxes. Luckily, their bites aren't deadly to humans, though they can cause illness. So for this sacrifice, we salute you, Mouse Army. For the Weather Channel, I'm Matt Moreno.
So we have a lot of traffic going back and forth for Guam because it's a major military base, just like Hawaii is a major military base. So it's tons of boats and airplanes going back and forth all the time. It would be really, really easy to unintentionally introduce a tree snake from Guam into Hawaii. By the way, do you guys think that plan of dropping acetaminophen-laden mice is effective?
Did they say they were dead?
Dead mice?
Yeah.
So the tree snakes don't care. They'll go after dead prey. So they'll eat them. But the criticism is that basically all you're then doing is selecting for snakes that avoid mice. So not all tree snakes will go for the mice. Most will. So you'll just kill off all the ones that will go for mice, and then you'll have basically super snakes that are smart enough not to go for mice left over, and that'll be those. Disease is a big one. Again, that's been making a lot of headlines in Hawaii, both human disease but also forest disease as well. There's a symposium on Tuesday about rapid ohia death, which is something we've talked about a couple of times in this class. This is all, we're getting this information in real time, sort of what's causing it, why now, where it came from. So I don't have a lot of facts for you yet. We're still trying to figure this all out. But what has emerged is that this is a really serious threat to our ohia forests, which dominates our native forests, so our native forests in general.
A recent flyover of Big Island Forest shows a fungal infection of ohia trees is worse than originally thought. The Department of Land and Natural Resources says in 2014, satellite imagery showed about 15,000 acres infected with the disease. But a recent aerial survey now shows the infection is spread to some 34,000 acres. The mysterious fungus targets a specific species of ohia tree and causes rapid ohia death.
We don't really know what how far this disease is going to go. We're working closely with researchers at USDA Forest Service and Agricultural Research Services who are looking into just what we can do about this disease, whether there are any tools out there that we can use in the field to stop it.
The state has issued a moratorium on the transport and shipment of ohia plants to help stop the spread of the disease. Ohia forests cover approximately 865,000 acres of land across the state and are important to our native wildlife and our watersheds.
So the best guess now is that the primary vector for this fungus is a beetle that will bore into a tree and then plant the fungus so it'll feed its larvae. So the fungus will grow into the tree, the larvae will emerge and will start eating this fungus. The beetle you can actually control if that were the only vector, but what they think is happening is that the spores are surviving in the beetle's frass, and then that gets wind dispersed, especially in hot, dry years like El Nino years. And so they think that it's sort of a 1-2 punch of this beetle, climate change, and dry environments, and the spread of these spores through the wind. If you're interested in helping out, there's this great campaign to actually go around to ohia forests and save as much of the seed as they can from as many different genetically distinct populations. Your classmate Tim is actually really involved in helping to store these seeds and go around and collect some of these. You can go online, you can donate some money if you want to, or you can, I think they're asking for help as well, so you can go check it out. The project's called Ohia Love, and they've raised, I think, over $40,000 just from really small donations of like $20 from people around Hawaii. So how can we prevent the spread of invasive plants, pests, or other things? It's sort of unclear. We don't yet know how to predict what's going to be invasive and what's not going to be invasive. The phylogenetic relatedness to other invasive things isn't a great predictor. Growth rates or traits of that organism aren't a great predictor. So much of it is context dependent. If it's an El Nino year, a hot year, or a wet year, whether or not that thing will establish and take, that our hands are sort of tied. And we don't have great guidelines to say, these are the types of agricultural things that we can import, these are the types of horticultural products that we can import, and these are the things that we absolutely shouldn't import. And so unfortunately, we're really just letting everything in at this point. It's important to note that people have been moving animals around for a really long time, right? And we know that the Polynesians were great at moving rats around. the important thing to note is that the magnitude is just so much different, right? And if we compare sort of the rates of introductions now, one every 18 days on average, compared to the rate of introductions that nature provided for us, that 1 in a million thing, long distance dispersal over oceans or on the foot of a Kolea, or floating in the North Pacific Gyre. I mean, we're just talking about orders of magnitude faster and more species being introduced. And this is something that our islands just really can't keep up with. There are a number of organizations on each island whose sole purpose is keeping tabs on and eradicating invasive species. And they're all ISC, right? So ISC, MISC, MOMISC, WISC, Oahu Invasive Species Council, Hawaii Invasive Species Council. These organizations are awesome. And if you want to help out either in the fields doing eradications or doing research on doing eradication, I strongly urge you to check out your local ISC. On Oahu, it's OISC. It's just a great organization with a lot of really smart, dedicated people where you can make a big difference. Okay, last but not least, humans are impacting our islands through urbanization, right? We know that the population of Hawaii is growing, not quite exponentially, but very, very quickly. We all experience this in gridlocked traffic, in the rising cost of rental housing, and it doesn't show any signs of abating. People are still moving to Hawaii at record rates. On Oahu, the most populous island of the archipelago, we feel this very, very strongly, right? And this is just one of many expansions that are slotted for Oahu in the near future. So this is Ho'opili, that's planned for the Kapolei area, sort of the central Oahu, they call it. It's going to take place over about 1,600 acres of former farmland. So it was sugar land. It's really fertile farmland. So Sierra Club sued against this development because we're trying to have sustainable food, producing our own food. We need to preserve land like this. We need to actually cultivate land like this. But instead, we're going to have a housing development, and they're slotted to construct almost 12,000 single-family homes. 12,000 new single-family homes. Who here commutes from the west side or from
Pearl City?
From Pearl City. Where do you commute from? Eva Beach. How long do you commute?
Could be an hour and a half. Yeah, with traffic, roughly about an hour.
You think 12,000 new homes in Kapolei is going to help that commute? Yeah, I mean, to me, it's unfathomable, And so people need to live somewhere, right? I also live somewhere, and I have a house, but I hope that we can plan a little bit smarter for how this growth happens, and concentrate it, and as we develop these growth plans, develop transportation infrastructure and agricultural infrastructure as well, so that we don't sort of degrade our own quality of life at the same time that we degrade our environment. I mentioned exploitation of resources as something that wasn't as pronounced in Hawaii as it has been other places. But I'll give you one example where we really have exploited our terrestrial resources, and this is sandalwood. Some of you may have seen a sandalwood tree here or there. If you're hiking, Aiea Loop actually has some great examples of sandalwood. There's a couple individuals growing around the Makapu'u area. But there used to be a lot of sandalwood in Hawaii. This was a real, relatively common tree, and there's a lot of species. What happened was Hawaii was a stopover on the way from fur traders that were going from the Pacific Northwest to Hong Kong to sell otter furs and seal furs, and they'd stop in Hawaii to resupply and then continue on to Asia. They realized, though, that there was a big market in Asia for sandalwood. It's a really fragrant wood that you could use to make jewelry boxes and figurines and things like that. So they realized they could cut their trip in half and not have to go all the way to the Pacific Northwest, and instead harvest sandalwood and sell that to Asia. So it really took off around 1810, it was this deal that was solidified with Kamehameha, where he gave access to Sandalwood to certain traders. In return, he actually got money and guns, which helped consolidate the Hawaiian Islands. But the thing about Sandalwood trade under Kamehameha was that the trade was really restricted. So he placed kapu on harvesting small, immature individuals. He didn't let populations diminish to the point where they were extirpated. It was a very well-controlled, almost sustainable enterprise. After Kamehameha died, all that went to pot. And Sandalwood degraded really, really quickly. A lot of chiefs would send their villagers up into the forest to collect quotas of sandalwood. And this was a real common scene where people would just harvest all the sandalwood in sight. Very, very quickly, the populations of sandalwood diminished to where it is today, where you have to look really hard. A lot of our species of sandalwood went extinct, and the ones that are still around are in very, very low population numbers. If you've been to Molokai on your way up to the TNC Bog Reserve, you can see this depression in the ground. And this is a sort of mock ship's hull that was built up on the mountainside, so they could measure exactly how much sandalwood could fit into the hull of a ship, because that was sort of the unit of trade, was that you would trade a certain amount of money for a ship's worth of sandalwood. So they would fill up one of these holes, measure it out, and then hike it down to the port where they would ship it off to Asia. Okay, I'm getting long-winded. We've killed a lot of our birds, a lot of our plants. An example within our sort of iconic hibiscus group, the group Abutillion, the Malvaceae. Pretty much all of our plants are endangered. The Hawaiian cotton plant is still okay. Hibiscadelphus is another genus in this group. 3 of the 7 species went extinct and the rest are endangered. Of hibiscus itself, of 5 species in that group, 3 are endangered, and we have 2 endangered subspecies. Coquia, 4 species in that genus, 1 of those is extinct, and the other 3 are endangered. Probably the last time I gave this lecture, 2 years ago, I would have told you about Hibiscadelphus woodii, which is one of the most critically endangered plants in Hawaii. There was 4 plants 2 years ago, sort of hanging on the side of a cliff. 3 of those plants got crushed by a boulder that got loosened and knocked out 3 out of the 4 surviving plants. And the last plant died in 2012 after I gave this lecture. So just in the time from when I gave this lecture 2 years ago to this year, another plant species has gone extinct. So this one is gone, unfortunately.
Which one's the hibiscus, the left or the right?
It's they're both hibiscus. That's its habitat on the left, sort of hanging on the side of a cliff. And then that's a close-up of the flower, what the flower looks like. Right, so that's just the summary. So, okay, so I've thoroughly depressed everybody. What's our hope? What are we gonna do about it? The good thing is we have a lot of good people working on conservation to combat human degradation. There's some important agencies, some of whom have come and given talks to us. So we have folks from DLNR, which includes our NAR system. We went to Kaina Point, that was a natural area reserve, where the types of activities that you can do in these NARs are pretty tightly controlled and restricted. This also contains Division of Forestry and Wildlife, known as DOFA. U.S. Fish and Wildlife is another service. These guys do what we call bureaucratic conservation, which isn't to denigrate what they do, it just means that they're sort of behind the scenes, passing regulation and doing research rather than enforcing conservation. After the Endangered Species Act was enacted in 1973, they were tasked with coming up with plans to protect those endangered species, as well as establishing critical habitat areas where you can buffer habitats to contain communities of native species together, which was sort of a big way forward. on Oahu, our essential habitat is drafted in 1990. Looks like this. So it's all those areas that are sort of shaded in blue. The circles are locations of some of our endangered species that are found on this island. So you see these critical habitats encompass the majority of those endangered species. Most of those areas you'll notice are sort of high elevation because we've pretty much given up on our low elevation sites. So our ridgelines still contain a lot of intact habitat where we can hope to conserve some of these species in some of these areas. Right. USGS is the U.S. Geological Survey. This used to be a part of the National Park Service. Now they've broken out on their own, so they don't just work in national parks anymore. This is where a lot of the research is done. So when you find research on endangered species, like a lot of the research that was done on our monk seals was funded by the USGS. And a lot of our terrestrial endangered species research is funded through USGS too. So they do the research, they feed the research to some of the other agencies that enact legislation and designate habitat to protect those invasive species. On campus, we have representatives of those agencies. So if you hang out in the biology or the zoology department, you probably have professors, or maybe you work with the Hawaiian Cooperative Fisheries Unit, or the HCF. And in the botany department, we contain the Pacific Cooperative Studies Unit, where a lot of these contracts to do research that's key for conservation actually takes place. So a lot of funds get funneled through our university and our department to do this real critical primary research. There's also a lot of private land owners and NGOs that are doing conservation work that are protecting habitat. Nature Conservancy is a major landowner, and a lot of the private landowners too, like Maui Land and Pine, Kamehameha Schools, own large swaths of Hawaii, some of which is being developed for agriculture and for development, and other of which is being set aside for conservation regions. So having land being held in big units by big landowners is actually a real benefit to conservation here in Hawaii as well, because we can work directly with those land users. Why aren't we doing more? There's a lot of different reasons why we're not doing more. We don't have much money, right? So our budget's limited. A lot of our budget goes to military. We don't have the expertise. We don't have enough people that know all the plants and all the insects and all the fish to do this work. Some of our populations are inaccessible, and some of our things are just, the populations are too small that we haven't even discovered them, right? We're talking about 4 plants on the side of a cliff. It's hard to stumble across that. If you can't really do good research on that plant, you're not going to be able to conserve it very effectively. I will say, if you're interested in extinctions on islands and human roles in that, I will assign some summer reading. The Song of the Dodo is a really accessible, well-written book where they go around to different islands around the world and talk about some of these factors, and some of the ways that people are combating extinction on islands. Has anybody read this book? Okay, you guys all do that over the summer. It's a real easy fun. This is my last lecture of the class, so I will leave you with a concluding comment that there are a lot of people working with many different agencies or organizations that are trying really hard to make a difference. Taking classes like Natural History of the Hawaiian Islands gives you an appreciation for what's out there, and hopefully we gave you some taste of the type of knowledge that you can employ to be good citizens, educated citizens of Hawaii to help conserve what's out there. So thank you all very much. So today we are, yeah, go ahead.
It's a secret.
Oh, drop my mic. Yeah, we're at like, okay. So today we're going to talk about the effects of humans on the terrestrial biota of the Hawaiian Islands. Let's just see a show of hands before we start. How many people think this is going to be a happy talk? Right. Well, so hopefully I will. It's not going to be a happy talk. I'll do the spoiler alert. But there are some rays of hope and some positives interspersed in this generally negative message. So keep your ears tuned for that. Before we get sad, though, just a couple of announcements. We made a deal with you for extra credit that if 80% of you complete your ECAPA evaluations, that everybody in the class gets 5 extra credit points on their final. For the first time, I've only been teaching it 4 years, so it's not like it's that long of a time, but for the first time ever, I haven't had to nag a class to actually get this done. You guys did it. So this is just from the botany sections. We had 30 students total. 26 of you already filled those out. 4 of you have yet to fill those out, but maybe you already did between me walking from my office way over here. Dr. Hunter had even like a higher response rate, I think. What were your response rates?
16 out of 20 and 11 out of 11.
Yeah, so congratulations, you guys are great. Who knows what the quality of those evaluations were, but the fact that you actually clicked on it makes me really happy inside. And we made you an even better deal thanks to your classmate John, who said, well, if all of us do it, then what do we get? So if all of you do it, if every single person in this class completes that evaluation, you all will get 10 extra credit points. And man, there's not very far to go. It looks like there's only a handful. So look left, look right, bug your neighbors, drag your friends out of bed and make sure they do that. Let's see if we can get 100%. Also, before we started, an announcement I was asked to make. One of your classmates is helping to organize this massive beach cleanup in Waimanalo, which is April 30th. That's Saturday, right? Saturday, Sunday? Saturday. These are super fun. I've done ones before with my little kid. They're fun for kids. They're fun for you guys. They're fun for old people. They have music. They have refreshments, and it does a lot of good. And they usually clean up like an ungodly amount of plastic up off the beach. So it's Waimanalo. It's supposed to be a beautiful day. Show up and help out. So it's 9:30 in the morning to noon. This one is not. Okay, so this is Sustainable Coastline. Sometimes Jack Johnson helps organize them, and you can like win tickets to his concerts and stuff. But I don't think this is one of those. But even so, it's definitely worth your while. Go check it out and help out. So let's talk just a little preamble about human impacts in the Hawaiian Islands. So these come from several different sources, right? We have invasive species. So these are the plants and the animals and the pathogens that we introduce to the island, sometimes inadvertently and sometimes on purpose. We have urbanization and habitat destruction, which are pretty self-evident and self-explanatory. We also have resource exploitation. Hawaii actually has relatively small amount of resource exploitation. I think fisheries are a great example of resource exploitation. I'm going to concentrate on terrestrial impacts today, and Dr. Hunter's going to follow up next week with marine impacts. I would say on the whole, with a few notable exceptions, we have not really exploited a ton of our terrestrial resources. So whereas that's an issue in other places that are extensively logged and extensively mined, Hawaii has escaped that largely for some reasons that we'll get into. I think this is probably the 3rd or 4th time that you've seen this idealized image of what Hawaii probably looked like 1,000 years ago. It was this paradise, right? It had tons of flightless ducks, giant moa nalu, these large flightless birds, thrushes, honey eaters, a lot of plants that we don't really have today, right? It looked like a pretty nice place, and I wish I could have seen it back then. Pre-contact changes, and this is European contact. This is obviously post-contact with Polynesian explorers and early Hawaiians. So we're talking about 600 years or so after Hawaiians first got here, before Captain Cook landed. There was a lot of changes that took place. And we learned a lot of these in the last lecture with Dr. Dye. The lower elevations especially were modified for farming and for villages. The rats came in and took out a lot of our palm forests, and then other lowland areas were cleared for agriculture and for settlement. Polynesians introduced animals, pigs and rats, among some others, and this had a pretty big impact, not just in human livelihoods, but also in the shape of this forest. They probably caused a lot of extinctions, and some of those we can actually back calculate based on the fossil record and the pollen record, and some of those we can just guess that probably a lot of things went extinct that we're never even going to know about. Kanaloa kahaoensis is one example that Dr. Dye talked about. If you remember going back in the pollen record pre-Polynesian arrival to Hawaii, this plant dominated Hawaiian landscapes. Its pollen is everywhere. It was all over the place. And we can imagine that there was just thickets of Kanaloa growing on all of the major Hawaiian islands. This is one that we thought was totally extinct. Nobody knew what this was until they were able to find, I think, 2 or 3 individuals off of a sea stack just off of Kaho'olawe. And they pieced it back together by looking at the pollen. So this is one that went from being pretty much the dominant shrub in Hawaii to practically extinct. I mean, it's sort of a miracle that it didn't go extinct. And these biggest impacts were probably what's classified as this late period. So it wasn't the initial arrivals in Hawaii that were subsisting low population levels, not introducing very many plants. It was this really sort of zenith of Hawaiian civilization pre-Captain Cook from about 1200 AD to 1500 AD, when most of these changes took place. So in the span of a very short amount of time, a handful of humans, maybe approaching a million handful of humans, who didn't have access to metal tools, were able to really transform the landscape and the biota of the Hawaiian Islands. Of course, when Captain Cook arrived and Europeans started coming to Hawaiian Islands, then things really went to hell in a handbasket really quickly. These impacts were much more extensive than anything that Hawaiians probably could even imagine. And again, most of these impacts remain at the lower elevations. This is where the most drastic impacts have taken place, but you also see human impacts, of course, at mid and high elevations as well. So it's not like once you go above the mosquito line, we just have pristine Hawaiian forests. As you all know, that's just not the case. So the most harmful invasive species that we can probably point to is not invasive insects or fish, but is really us. And it's important for us to acknowledge our role in the environmental degradation of the Hawaiian Islands. So let's start with some definitions. We talk about things that don't belong in Hawaii, be they plants, be they insects, be they fish. We often use words like alien, non-native, non-indigenous, foreign, exotic, introduced species. These are all different ways to describe this same type of biota. Things that, species that occur outside of their natural ranges and outside of their dispersal potential. So these are things that never would have made it somewhere were it not for humans bringing them, right? So a lot of these things when we talk about alien species or non-native species in Hawaii, we're talking about things that humans brought because the odds are just way, way too low that they would have made them here on their own. Are all alien species also invasive species? No, they're not. So invasive species are all alien species. So all invasive species happen to be non-native, happen to be non-indigenous, they happen to be alien. But to be invasive means something a little bit different. There's a higher bar, a lower bar to pass under. So we call invasive species that are non-native, so they have to be non-native, but whose introduction causes or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or a harm to human health. So these are things that establish, in order to sort of cause these adverse effects to humans and to our livelihoods, they probably have to be able to naturalize, they probably have to be able to reproduce here. pretty quickly and in pretty large enough numbers to actually cause havoc on our ecosystems. And once that happens, there's a whole slew of things that can happen. And this isn't always the case. Some invasive species are more or less innocuous. They change our landscape, but they don't really affect our day-to-day lives. But a lot of invasive species can have tremendous economic impacts. So it can lead to loss of economically important resources, plants, animals, but also things like water, soil, other things that we take for granted that are sort of indirectly affected by invasive species. There can be an economic impact when we actually go out and try to eradicate some of these things. A lot of invasive species take root in places that are really inaccessible, that require helicopter trips, and expensive chemicals or big crews of people that weed invasive plants. How many of you have worked, a summer job weeding some sort of invasive plant? Okay, so it's a real rite of passage, right, for folks in Hawaii, or for kupu, or for ONRP, or for one of the national parks, getting rid of ginger or myconia or some of these other nasty plants, right? It's a lot of work. They probably paid you something, hopefully, so all that adds up. Environmental impacts can be really severe. We've learned a lot about extinctions, loss of biodiversity, and again, loss of ecosystem services like air and water, things that we need to survive. So how much of a impact are we talking about? What's the bottom line here? The costs are tremendous. So these are annual costs associated with non-native species. This is US-wide, this isn't Hawaii-wide. But altogether, when you look at plants and microbes and mollusks, we think this is about $136 billion per year. And this was an estimate from 2000, so this is a couple of decades old now. I haven't found the updated numbers, but I'm going to guess these numbers haven't gone down, right? So this is not quite as much as we're spending in wars in the Middle East, but it's a pretty good chunk of change that we're spending dealing with the costs associated with invasive species. Hawaii is a small landmass, as we know, but this is really ground zero for invasive species. So we probably have the worst interaction with invasive species of any state in the nation. We have about as many non-native species, when we're talking about plants, living in Hawaii as we do native species. So if you look at a plant, if you're just going by species numbers, you're not going by abundance, pick up a plant, there's a 50-50 chance it's native or invasive. It's not like that on the continent. Most places you go on the continent, if you pick up a plant, odds are that thing is native to that spot. You don't freak out when you see a native plant like you do here because they're so rare. This is a real Hawaii problem that we're working with. Yeah, we have the third highest rate of invasive species in the world. And there's a quote here from Governor Cayetano that for the past 5 years, an average of 100 new alien plants each year have been discovered in the islands. So that means a new pest reaches Hawaii every 18 days on average. What this means for us is that we're losing a lot of our scenic landscapes. Haleakala Crater, probably in 15 years, 20 years, if we don't do something about invasive pines, will look like California. That crazy moonscape is just going to be covered in pine trees. Feral pigs are really doing a number too. And it has a big impact on agriculture as well. So we lose a lot of our crops to invasive insects, things like fruit flies, invasive snails, viruses, and things like that. Really take a heavy toll on our agriculture. And this is one reason why our pesticide inputs are so high, are so heavy in Hawaii, is because we deal with these tremendous pest loads. And there's some other impacts as well, right? We have health and safety impacts. I think you guys have all been reading the news about Zika virus and dengue fever, right? These are invasive pathogens that are vectored by invasive insects. These are spread by mosquitoes that are making a lot of us pretty scared about our health, especially if you're traveling to Kona these days. We worry about dangerous or poisonous species. We showed you a couple slides of deadly mushrooms that were invasive species that are associated with invasive plants. Not a super high, not a very common cause of illness or death, but it does affect us as Hawaiians when the people living in Hawaii, when we collect these things, or when our dogs eat poisonous mushrooms. Building damage caused by fungus, and of course things like coqui frogs, which are just really annoying. And if they reach high enough densities, could adversely affect things like tourism here in Hawaii, property values. So some of these things get here intentionally, and some of these things get here by accident. And it's shocking to think that a lot of our worst invasive species were actually brought here on purpose, deliberately. Strawberry guava is an example of a plant that was brought here intentionally by what was known as a naturalization society. So these were groups of nerdy people like us that were really interested in plants and birds from other parts of the world, and recognized how wonderful our climate was here and how easy it would be to grow some of these things here in Hawaii. And so strawberry guava was introduced in 1825 because it was so delicious and people thought it would grow really well here. It turned out it grew great here, right? And so now it's a crazy, crazy problem. This map of the Hawaiian Islands, all those areas in red are where guava is already present, where we can already find strawberry guava. It's a lot of red. The areas in yellow are where the potential range for strawberry guava is, where it could spread. And of course, this is synergistic, right? The pigs love to eat strawberry guava, so this maintains really high pig population levels. Pigs eat it and then poop it elsewhere, and so it creates more strawberry guava elsewhere. And so pigs and strawberry guava are working together to really invade a lot of our Hawaiian habitats. Not just plants, but game animals are another, have a wonderful history of being introduced to Hawaii. Not just by Polynesians, but also by contemporary residents of Hawaii. So the axis deer is something that was actually first established on Molokai. So this was brought over as a present from the government of Hong Kong to Kamehameha V as a game animal. This is something that's typically found like in the low Himalayas in Asia. So it was brought over, it was gifted to King Kamehameha. He established it on Molokai, where he would go over and hunt them. And in the 1950s, they thought that it would be fun to bring this axis deer over to Maui for military veterans, for hunting clubs, for people that wanted to go hunting and looking for game animals. So they brought axis deer over to Maui in the late 1950s. And it went gangbuster. And if you've been to Maui, if you spend much time on Maui, you have probably almost hit one of these things driving up country, because the population density is astounding. It's wreaked havoc on a lot of agriculture in Maui. People hit them with their cars all the time, and it's something where the population is so out of control, it's unlikely that we'll ever be able to control it. The good news was that up until recently, the axis deer populations were restricted to places where we had brought them intentionally, Maui and Molokai, right? They're not great swimmers. It's not like they're going to cross any of these oceanic channels and establish on new islands. That takes human help. Well, it just so happens that in 2009, they got that human help, where a helicopter pilot who was in cahoots with a game hunting lodge actually airlifted 4 axis deer from Maui and dropped them on Big Island. And he didn't want to go back empty-handed, so he picked up mouflon sheep from Big Island and dropped them on Maui. This happened recently. I mean, this was 7 years ago that this happened. People didn't know what happened. All of a sudden, they started noticing that there was axis deer on Big Island, and they thought that was weird. And they noticed that there was mouflon sheep on Maui. And then this whole scheme turned out. So they arrested this pilot. They arrested this lodge owner that was behind this whole scheme. But this legacy still lives on. So now we have axis deer on Big Island and mouflon sheep on Maui. And every once in a while you hear about pumas and jaguars running around on the hillsides, right? We have wallabies. We have a wallaby population up in Nu'uanu Valley. So these are other animals that people have brought for whatever reason that have escaped and have established. And so this is not an uncommon occurrence, as silly as it may sound. And of course, domestic animals, we brought those to cats. I have a cat. I'm not going to say I love my cat, but I have a cat. So I'm guilty of this too. She's spayed, of course, so she's not going to reproduce. But we have a big problem with invasive, feral cat populations all over campus. You guys have all seen this, right? So they eat our songbirds. They spread disease that attacks our marine mammals. Even if you're a cat lover, you sort of have to see the writing on the wall to realize that these cats are not good for Hawaiian ecosystems. This middle figure right here is a graph from USGS that was sampling the stomach contents of cats captured in 2 subalpine sites in Hawaii Island. So pretty high elevation, predominantly native sites. And what you can see is they're eating some invertebrates, so they're eating some insects and lizards and things. They're eating some mice, but they're eating a ton of songbirds, including a lot of our native remaining songbirds. So domestic cats are vicious. They'll hunt songbirds just for sport. So having them around is not really compatible with also maintaining our few remaining populations of songbirds. And so this is our fault for introducing cats and letting the populations get out of control. Not everything we do intentionally. We have a lot of accidental introductions. Some of the marine introductions, I don't know if you're going to talk about this, Dr. Hunter. Things are introduced in ballast water, so we think this is how mosquitoes got here. Ships that do major ocean crossings have to deal with very, very rough water. If you're an empty ship, that makes you very top-heavy and it makes you rock back and forth. And it can be sort of dangerous because it increases the probability that you'll capsize. So one way to deal with top-heavy empty boats is to fill these boats with what's called ballast water. So boats will suck up water into their holds, into specialized tanks that makes them heavier. It lowers that center of gravity so that they're not as prone to tipping over. When you have sort of unequal trade, in places like Hawaii where we import a lot of things but don't export a lot of things, a lot of times you'll have empty ships going one way and full ships going another way. So ships will arrive with a full ballast tank. We'll empty that ballast tank, take on goods, and then sail elsewhere. Of course, when they take on all that water and then spit all that water out in other areas, they're spitting out not just water, but also a ton of potentially very, very noxious invasive creatures. And this is probably how mosquitoes got to Hawaii, was in a ballast tank, as well as any number of marine invertebrates and pathogens. Yeah.
But I thought mosquito larvae, they don't like salt water because if these ships they're filling their ballast with salt water, right?
Yeah. So, I don't have a great answer for that. So, I don't know, but that's a good point. I'll have to think about that. But anyway, tons of marine things are brought in. And even when you're not talking about ballast water, just in things like packing pallets and crates, we introduce all sorts of other, unintentionally introduce all sorts of other pests as well. But that's a good point about the salt water. If you have a Christmas tree that you put up in your house, that Christmas tree, there's a few local Christmas tree farms where we're growing Doug fir and pine, which is another problem, but let's ignore that for the fact. Some of them grow cook pines or Norfolk pines as well. But most of the trees that you'll buy, if you just go to your sort of corner tree farm, those are imported from the Pacific Northwest. Of course, a lot of times you're not just importing trees, but you're importing everything that's living on that tree. They try to control for invasive snails and invasive pests by dunking trees in hot water. It's not very good for the tree. It doesn't help it live much longer, and it's not a 100% foolproof way of getting rid of pests. So every year, the snail lab here on campus does a census of unintentional introductions that come on Christmas trees, and they always find a ton of things that get here, right? Our produce too, especially our horticulture, where we bring over live plants, is real prone to co-introducing unintentional organisms. And this is just a silly story of a guy in the UK who was bit by a tropical spider on a bunch of bananas that hitched a ride. So that happens. Pampas grass, crested wheatgrass, and all sorts of nasty algae and fish are also have been introductions through horticulture, the flower industry, ornamental